The events I recount in this tale are no form of self-aggrandizing prose, nor are they an attempt to prove my own sanity, which I know now to be questionable. Rather, I tell this story in hopes that no unfortunate soul will ever again stir the anomaly that awaits in Sector XVLL8. If you have the preconceived notion that my writing this is a sign of good health, I can say only that nothing of what I once was remains now. I was, prior to writing this document, a scrivener. Those outside the inner sector may not be aware of our duties, in the same way I am still largely unaware. But if one could imagine the synthesis of an explorer, a cartographer, and a chronicler, you wouldn't be far from the mark. I would voyage through time and space, revealing the threads of existence for what they were, mundane compared to the fiction of the late 25th century. Do not mistake my jaded view upon the cosmos for wishing ignorance instead, for I admit, in the state I find myself now, I do not look fondly upon my travels, the apex of which made clear the horrid truth of existence. We are all alone amongst the universe, born only to die as everything before us has. But I wonder now, can the same be said of the thing in XVLL8? From the start, the expedition to the sector struck me as unusual. I was made aware of a passenger vessel lost within the tide of a black hole present there, lovingly named the Abyssal Maw. I had never before undertaken a rescue operation, nor was it a scrivener's function. Logically, I concluded I was sent instead to perform a post-mortem of sorts on the remains of a ship locked there in gravitational limbo. I recall the space there a particular shade of violet that reminded me of satin silk. In almost all directions this fabric was unending, broken only by the maw whose siren call beckoned even light to its grave. The cataclysmic death of a star was stitched into the fabric there as a blinding pale disk pierced by an eye of non-existence, a moment in time, captured forever by sheer force of cosmic devastation. It was for that reason that one would find themselves an adversary to gravity when doing any sort of expedition near a stellar body so immense. One must always adhere to its will, lest we find ourselves returning thousands of years later with the recollection of minutes. I knew I would need to be careful. In regards to distance, where I was then was safe, though to make any form of meaningful observation I would need to travel close enough to study the cadaver of whatever was lost therein. I steered myself deeper into the maw's hold with manifestation of pure thought. Our network of appendages had gone from a pair of feeble arms and legs to an orgy of machine and flesh, the likes of which was made clear as I brought myself deeper into the well of gravity. The feeling of pressure upon the ship's hull was a feeling shared upon me, as a titanic grip slowly squeezing down upon my mortal body. But closer I traveled. Every second forward came with further pressure until finally it felt as though I was encased in lead. At that range, I knew I could spend no more than a week, lest my son grow old and die, wondering whatever happened to his old fool of a father. From there, I searched upon Light's terminus for any sign of that lost ship, and I saw it then. Not with my own eyes, for they hadn't opened in decades, but in lenses all about the bow, I saw a thing redshifted to near oblivion upon the dark eye of the maw. From that distance, it looked no larger than a capsule and was relatively similar in shape. The fact that it was even visible was a testament to its truly immense size, larger than any ship ever wrought in Union yards. This was no civilian vessel. I concluded instead that it must have been a secret project of some kind, no surprise to me, as we've always had some sort of phallic obsession with size, and so along I went with my observations. My ship's onboard intelligence recorded and deciphered my thoughts into a legible report. My extended eyes were powerful, capable of zooming to a factor of many hundreds without loss, and so I could look upon the capsule, but only guess vaguely at its purpose. Its ovoid body gave no suggestions, though clearly its shape and size housed something of great significance if it required a shell so large. As I recorded my thoughts, I felt them begin to drift away into meaninglessness, like I was falling into a trance, a growing high I couldn't shrug. Panic crept up within me with no obvious induction, and with it came the primal sensation of being preyed upon. For a single, surreal moment I thought I saw the ship grow larger, and with it I felt upon me a dread the likes of which I had never known. It was then that the first of many unusual mishaps would occur, so particularly unusual I now question the truth of their origin. A sudden force propelled me from my stupor in a start. My breathing was heavy, my body sore. I felt about myself for a wound and found it in the form of a small breach atop the ship, a jagged tear left upon a section of plating retrofitted not weeks ago to be more up-to-date with Union standards. To be this near a black hole was a hazard to be sure, but at that distance? No, my body should have been more than capable of withstanding the Maw's call. The thought would have to wait, for the tear was leaking oxygen at an alarming pace, and the threat of suffocation became very real. Once the phantom pain had passed, I returned to my meditation in search of a fix. An armada of drones sallied forth, a hive mind of my control. They searched throughout my body, first within my isolation chamber, a cloistered place where in the center I dangled a ganglion, anemic thing, adhered via a morass of cords splaying forth from my spine. I made it a point to not often look upon my mortal self lest I become sickened by dysmorphia. I tore my vision away, searched beyond the chamber's doors and into the cargo bay, filled so entirely with steel packages as to create a maze even for the drones to navigate. Further, I commanded them, out from their burrows and into the void beyond. From the outside, I was a sorry-looking thing. The golden Union paneling was beginning to strip away in many places, and now drifted off into the maw, leaving instead the steel vestiges of the ship's makers whose craft was unfit for modern vanity. It was thanks in part to a dull ache I felt in what could only be described as a leg that I discovered a problem far worse than I could have imagined. One of my rotating thrusters had been damaged and was devoid of all signs of ionic life present in the other. Something from the breach must have caused it. Whatever the case, the fix would have to wait, for the more pressing matter of my asphyxiation was at hand. And so to work my drones went, my thoughts choreographing a ballet of flittering golden spheres that danced through their warrens at the stern of the ship, tasked with welding shut the hemorrhaging gash. But my mastery over machine was rendered destitute as the lens of a drone caught sight of something that in an instant made me a child again, complete with a wonderment I thought had abandoned me. The potential of that strange ship was made clear to me, for despite it being well within the Maw's Bastille, a place where even light was imprisoned, it had now grown larger. Its color was no longer that deep red, but instead a pale white so blinding in its radiance as to transcend the dying star behind it. It had drawn closer to me in my inattention. I lost all control over my thoughts. My heart thudded in my chest as my vision returned to the paltry pair of lenses on my mortal suit. Try as I might, I could not maintain the mindfulness necessary to return to that point of omnipotent control. Instead, I called forth video captures of the thing into my vision to test my memory for faults, and indeed I found a thing that defied all scientific knowledge. For a moment I stared at the image of the thing, attempting in vain to make sense of it in my mind. My reverence was soon eclipsed by a growing anxiety that washed through my veins like acid. At the time, I couldn't describe it. I can make sense of it now only as an instinct born of primeval danger intuition. I felt upon me the predatory gaze of something greater than I, and for the very first time I bore the terrifying thought that this thing was not of our accord. As powerful a force as fear was, my own sense of pride was enough to overcome it. Perhaps I felt I had a name to uphold, or even that I had something to prove. Either way, in spite of myself, I steadied my breathing and returned to my meditation, following my heart from a gallop to a canter to a slow and steady trot. I returned myself to that place of control. The drones outside had drifted a great deal toward the maw, lacking the inertial dampeners necessary to resist the allure of gravity. For the time, they all faced the entity, and lest I find myself locked in its gaze again, I tore my attention from it and back to my ship to be confronted by a terrible realization. Not only had the drones drifted closer to its grasp, so too had I. Several of my front-facing eyes were now being plucked from me by the maw, racking me with a stabbing pain. In my stupidity, I had not even thought of the damage thruster's role in keeping me from the maw, which had now grown larger in the sky, larger enough that I knew I had lost time back home. I wrenched myself around to spare myself from further pain as I set myself the task of welding the breach, hoping the managing of that would give me the confidence necessary to repair the thruster. The simple procedure was made difficult by the thought of the entity encroaching further upon me with every moment spent inattentive of it. If indeed it was closing in, I would need to work quickly lest it eclipse me with its colossal size. With the breach nearly shut, I gave partial attention to the thruster, and therefore upon the maw, and to my horror upon the capsule. Or rather, where it used to be. I nearly lost myself again as that primate inside me revolted against all I had become. I had lost it. Far and wide I searched for its whereabouts, and all that stared back at me was the light-lidded eye of the maw. I searched in records for an image of the thing, to find them barren. It seemed impossible, for it was not moments ago I looked upon those very same records that proved my sanity. I feared then that I had conjured it in a fit of oxygen deprivation, or perhaps that my proximity to the maw was visiting upon me a brain damage that came in the form of bad memory. Suddenly, my sentience was a place plagued by self-doubt, a mental fog that obscured reality from fiction. I searched for my ship's oxygen levels, and indeed they were low, but not terminally so. Furthermore, the event horizon was growing upon me. I knew I had withstood far worse in my past. As all those thoughts coursed through my head, they became accompanied by an otherworldly sound, like that of static, rushing water even. I knew then that I needed to leave, for whatever was becoming of me was not something I wished to see to the end. All I could do was handle what was in front of me. I returned my mind to my drones, and as I searched about the thruster's enormous exterior, I found no obvious signs of damage. It was when I opened the maintenance panel and looked upon its innards that the problem was made clear to me. The copper contact had been melted, an easy fix but for the fact that these drones weren't equipped with copper to spare. The housing of our eyes, however, sported it in abundance, and as the ship's exterior was being peeled away bit by painful bit, I knew I had the eyes to spare. Or so I thought. Darkness. It washed over my vision in a slow and steady loss of machine awareness. The drones had malfunctioned. I searched myself for signs of a power failure, though no record of such a thing was apparent. My heart was steady. It wasn't a failure on my part. I thought then that it had been a system failure, seemingly impossible as these drones had been tested to a torturous extent on their craft world, and yet they were gone. My options were running thin. I attempted to call forth another wave of drones only to find their burrows empty. Until then I had been operating under the cavalier rationale that I was somehow above death, or rather that I would ward it off until the day it came. It was in that moment that the direness of my situation set in, and with it the very real possibility that this was the moment I had been postponing all this time. I considered my options one at a time. The only real choice was clear to me from the very beginning, though my reluctance towards it led me to feign ignorance of it. Valuable time wasted as my body was being stripped from me. A whir and accompanying clang tore me from my thoughts near the same time as I felt my mind seize with an electric shock. It seemed that more of my body was rebelling against me. I returned my vision to my suit's perspective and watched as system failure was made manifest further. My chamber's doors had slammed shut only to reopen. It then would repeat the process again in a metallic cacophony that drowned away all thought. I attempted to call the door to the forefront of my mind only to be assaulted by what I could describe as the equivalent of hieroglyphics. I searched my thoughts for the guiding omnipotence within me, but even there I was beset by meaningless symbols in a language my true mind wasn't equipped for. The floodgate that was my intelligence was a necessary buffer between mortal thought and machine consciousness, and it had burst. I could perform simple protocols with the limited knowledge I had of this strange language, but to control my limbs... No, I was all too incapable. It was with that failure I knew I was close to the end. I knew my metal body could withstand hellish gravity, but at that distance, it was no doubt to the shipwright's delight that I wasn't totally demolished. I had no options left. Finally, I would relent my ignorance and accept the answer that had been obvious to me from the beginning. I would need to disconnect from my body. I would need to fix the thruster myself. In that moment, I rathered to resign myself to death than give up what I had become. The thought made me shudder. I had to reassure myself it would be temporary. I could return at any time. Yet still, the prospect of survival was far outweighed by my fear of detachment. This would be the first time in 20 years that I would be without my extended body. I hadn't even held my son with mortal arms, nor looked upon my wife with organic eyes. Was I really so afraid of my own flesh and bone? The simple answer was yes. I delayed the inevitable cravenly. Every second leading up to it was one I knew I would regret, and yet I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was, in theory, a simple protocol. I only had to give a single command devised for emergencies like the one I had found myself in. In practice, however, I would be a paraplegic to what I was just moments prior. Indeed, I resigned myself to death, hoping the moment would come that I would be pulled into the vacuum of space and torn asunder in a brief and glorious moment of loss. But it was that very instant I feared, for more than detachment, more even than the thing my mind had crafted. You see, it wasn't bravery that led me to continue on. No, it was the probability that death was a finality that made obsolete one's entire existence, that life, like a foreign dream, could disappear entirely. No, not bravery. It was in fear of dream's end that I roused myself from despondence. I gritted my teeth and flexed hard as the ship's lights flared in blinding radiance. I began to count down. I would do it on 3. 1. My breathing became heavy. I felt my heart slamming hard on its cage as that sound of rushing water returned as a torrent in my ears. 2. I bit down on my lip and could hear and feel my anxiety swelling. 3. A sonorous hiss was accompanied by the sound of metal retracting from flesh. The pain poured through me as I suddenly floated there, fetal and incapable. It was a pitiful sight, screaming and writhing like some sort of helpless newborn. Every yowl was met with shock, as I hadn't heard my own voice in so long I thought it to be some foreign creature. The pain I felt then was unlike anything I could describe. I felt it within me and around me as a spectral throb that matched the cadence of my frail heart. My vision returned to my suit's front-facing lenses, and I stared for the first time in decades at my appendages, these forsaken arms and legs. I was still shaking, and I can only guess now at how much time I had lost before I felt myself capable of thought again. I splayed my fingers out in front of me, feeling the webbing between them tightening. I looked upon them first as tumors infesting me. Articulation was a phantasmal echo of thought, complete with the delay of nerves and neurons that made us so primitive. I had to practice basic movement, at first reminding myself of how it felt to own such unwieldy appendages. I then began floating from wall to barren wall in search of an access panel that would halt the door's momentum. I would find my chamber empty of all but the harness that sustained me. My thoughts again were cut short. The wailing doors of my ship were a death trap, especially for someone so incapable as I. I knew I didn't like my odds of survival if I were caught between them. I tested my propulsion from afar, accustoming myself to my mortal limbs. I reminded myself that the gravity of the maw was a weight upon them, though I knew that despite that I was still a debilitated and emasculated thing. I continued my test. Every 4.5 seconds the doors would slam shut, and then open another 1.5 later. Some of my tests would result in me being cut in half, while others would culminate in decapitation, which was a welcome death compared to the majority of results that involved loss of limb. A long time had passed until I felt an even mild comfort in the possibility of survival. By then in Union space I was likely engraved on a memorial somewhere, a reminder of the barbaric age of mortal spaceflight. I shook the thought from my head, and steadied my frantic breathing. Again I counted down. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. I threw myself forward with all my might. The legs that had carried up people across plains for millennia now carried me through those infernal jaws. I had done it. My celebration was cut short. A sudden jolt of pain shot through me as I was thrown violently against the cargo bay's wall. The massive cords that draped from my spine like a shawl had been lacerated as they were caught between the doors, and in turn had tugged hard against the connection in my spine. For a moment I was entirely incapable of movement. Anxiety was upon me as a thick coat of sweat. The possibility of paralysis dawned upon me, a fear that was soon confirmed as I found my lower body completely incapable. I heard again that sound of rushing water, and tasted salty tears upon my lips. To lose my true self was one thing, but to lose those legs... The maw would give me no quarter. It wanted everything from me. What was I in that moment? The answer was dismally simple. I was an organism whose fear of death outweighed the depression set to anesthetize me. I could only think of moving forward one moment in time after the next. Forward. Ever forward for fear of that final lidfall. I could mourn the loss of my legs later. As for now, I was flying and had no use for them. Or so I told myself. In truth, I felt sadness for a pair of things I had forsaken until only moments ago. Malice rose within me as I returned my thoughts to the cargo bay, and more specifically to a panel on the nearest wall that read, "Door malfunction." It blinked its warning in mocking laughter that was made all the more sinister as I looked for a long moment upon the labyrinth of crates and realized the impossibility of it all. I was trapped. I knew that beyond the bay were the hangar doors, and beyond that the void. My suit was airtight. I could survive the vacuum. The contents of the bay, however, would not. I pondered the ramifications of vacuuming the cargo, the combined worth of which was likely more valuable to the Union than I was. It was a thought that, as it occurred to me, filled me with a disdain I never thought myself capable of. Still, I fostered in my mind the childlike notion of duty toward a heap of callous doctrinaires who had used me expendably for decades, culminating in the hell I found myself in. Could I blame them, though? Unlike machines, life is easily reproducible. We are so damn good at it that we overflowed from one planet to the next, claiming all before us in our viral crusade. To the void with it all. I executed the protocol into the remarkably still working access panel and struggled hard to gain purchase on any bit of metal available to me. The sudden flood of oxygen into space tore away the bay's contents like linen in a maelstrom. My body twisted in spite of my arm's natural rotation, and I believe now the only thing that kept me together was the tightness of my suit. I weathered the flurry of pain with a strength I never knew I had. Soon, like a foregone storm, the pain subsided as the presentiment of the maw filled my mind. Nothing could prepare me for what I would see as I faced myself around. There before me, wreathed by the light of that dying star, was the entity in its true and malign form. Its monstrous size appeared to belittle the stellar titan behind it, and I felt its unseen eye upon my being. Despite it being there before me, I could glean no insight as to what it truly was, for even its color appeared to me as a plumage of hypnotic iridescence. The knowledge that it watched me was one born of intuition, and I looked upon it as a supplicant before their god. My attempts at thought and movement were in vain. I felt a numbness overtake me as I drifted toward it, despite my mind and body screaming for flight. What drove me forward then I didn't know, but now in grim reminiscence I believe it was calling me. I felt like a marionette, dangled there at the hangar doors, a precipice beyond which there would be no return. My eyes were locked upon it as it grew larger, if not in space then in my mind. I felt it in front of me, within me, inducing me into the finality that was the void beyond my ship. The source of the sound was clear to me then, as despite all possibility I heard emanating from the thing a cataclysmic flood that threatened to wash me into its strange dimension. Something appeared in my mind then. Perhaps a vision, or maybe a hallucination. It was the vague silhouette of a humanoid thing, breaking the emberous glow of a dying flame with its hunched stature. Turned to me and revealed a rigid face whose brow and nose overcame its shadow-carved features. I wish I knew why my mind conjured that of all things, but in an instant I saw clarity. I awoke from my stupor with a start, as fear drove stakes through me. I seized desperately for purchase on anything I could find lest I drift away, and I found it. It came in the form of a metal tube that made up the exterior vent for the warrens that belonged to my lost drones. I wrenched myself towards my ship and felt my body slam hard against the metal exterior of it, whose golden plating had been stripped away to reveal the steel of ages past. I began to scale my amputated body. Every moment risked the possibility of losing the piece of metal that was the last best hope I had for survival. Finally, I found myself upon the damaged thruster. I searched about me for any form of copper available to repair it and found it in a single form. My eyes. I felt about my faceplate until I found the crevice that would give way to a viewing port, one I had never used. It peeled away with remarkable ease, but I was made entirely blind. A horror dawned upon me as I realized. I had forgotten entirely how to open my mortal eyes. I blinked closed lids and filled crust that sewed them shut. I struggled blindly with the severed faceplate, tugging at a tiny bead-like lens. I pulled at it until finally it separated, though my hysteria-stricken hands were all too unprepared for its sudden departure. I grasped wildly in space around me for it, but it was gone. Finding it would be an impossible task, for it could be in truly infinite space around me. I had one chance left. Again I tugged, and as the bead gave way, I gripped hard on it, feeling it between my thumb and forefinger. I returned to the thruster's internals and felt for the sundered wire. All the while I felt that thing behind me growing like a bad omen. With a firm grip on the bead with one hand, I bent away the copper housing of it until it came loose. I worked in the dark, and felt again the thing closer upon me than ever before. All the while I worked at the bit of copper until it resembled in touch the same shape of the contact it would replace. The hold would be bad, my odds slim, but I had no choice. With the task done, I closed the panel and began my descent back into my ship, a climb that led me closer to the flood. Every hold was a struggle, due either to gravity or that thing's Chthonian gaze. To explain that I felt words spoken through me in that discord of rushing hell would defy all knowledge, and yet I did. It was a nebulous stream of consciousness that in my ignorance I could only form into words who couldn't ever hope to capture the true meaning. Words like chaos, order, existence, and non-existence were all I could use, and even then they were naught but mortal utterings. Suddenly I felt as though I was drifting into a dreamlike haze in which time no longer felt constant. One moment I was atop my ship, the next I was in the cargo bay, and the next I was fumbling blindly for a means of closing the hangar doors and drilling into the ether. These moments were panels placed alongside each other without the vital threads of time to stitch them together. In one such panel I found myself in tears that moistened the crust about my eyes, enough so that I could just barely stretch one open. I could see, despite the maltreatment I had wrought upon them, I saw the panel that connected to my ship's intelligence, or rather the remnants of it. Despite all odds, the panel was still working. Soon behind me, the doors were closing as the ship gathered power to perform the plunge. I prayed in that moment to a crater I thought I had no faith in. I looked behind me and saw beyond the closing lids of the hangar doors a squall of blinding geometry, as that horrible thing was now so close that it encompassed my vision. I screamed as light itself began to bend all around me, and I could only guess at my proximity to death. Darkness all around me. I felt for any sign of existence. Had I slipped into the maw? Worse yet, had I slipped into whatever strange dimension that entity called upon in that final moment? No, I felt metal upon my hand suddenly, and with the sensation of touch came the breathing of a red light within the bay. I searched a port-side viewing window for any sign of my whereabouts. Relief poured over me, washed away anxiety as I felt beads of sweat cold upon my nape. I was within the gravitic cradle of a yellow star that was now rising over a world clouded and blue. In time, I managed to repair my ship's guidance, and in that time I found those hands more capable than I ever recalled. It was a shame that the last vestiges of power were drained upon landing, and I can only guess now at how much time had passed since I begun my expedition. 100 years, too? For what I can say, it has been 3 years since I have landed on this jungle planet, and in that time I have managed to regain composure of my legs, first as a fumbling cripple, and then as a scrivener of a different kind. I explore this world in hopes of finding those who terraformed it, and instead only find vague reminders of who we, once were, in ruins of gold-stripped steel. It is from one such place I record my tale. I find peace in this solitude, and though at times I lament the loss of my old life, I know it too lamented mine. Perhaps there will come a day I return to the stars, should fate allow it. Perhaps I will even return to XVLL8, to visit whatever it was that had visited me. Too often I guess at the nature of that thing. In the daylight hours I remarked that it was indeed just a figment born of deprivation, or perhaps crafted in place of something my mind couldn't hope to understand. Those thoughts bring me no small amount of comfort. But it is when night falls and the sky turns that particular shade of violet that I know within my primal being the truth of that encounter, and feel upon me the nether eye of that strange deity, that watcher in the dark.